The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Boston Municipal Court, casting long shadows across Judge Michael Bennett's polished wooden desk. At exactly 8:30 a.m., just like every other weekday for the past 15 years, he straightened his black robes and adjusted his reading glasses. Another day, another dollar, he mumbled to himself, a habit he'd developed over years of sitting alone in his chambers before court sessions. At 62 years old, Judge Bennett took pride in his punctuality and strict adherence to rules. His gray hair, neatly combed to one side, and his perfectly pressed robes gave him an air of authority that matched his reputation. Sarah, his court clerk for the past decade, knocked softly on his chamber door. "Good morning, Your Honor. We have 27 cases today, mostly traffic violations. The courtroom is already filling up." Judge Bennett nodded, picking up his morning coffee. "Let's not keep them waiting, then. Any notable cases I should know about?" "Nothing unusual, sir. The usual mix of parking tickets, speeding violations, and a few minor disputes," Sarah replied, shuffling through her papers. As Judge Bennett walked through the private corridor leading to his courtroom, he could hear the quiet murmur of voices on the other side of the door. He liked this moment best, the calm before diving into hours of decision-making and maintaining order in his courtroom. Officer James Rodriguez, the court bailiff, stood at attention as the judge approached. "All rise." His voice boomed through the courtroom as Judge Bennett entered. The shuffle of feet and rustle of clothing filled the air as everyone stood up. Looking out over the crowded courtroom, Judge Bennett saw the usual morning crowd. Young people in casual clothes who probably stayed up all night worrying about their first court appearance. Middle-aged professionals checking their watches repeatedly, anxious to get back to work. A few elderly citizens who arrived extra early to make sure they wouldn't be late. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice firm but not unkind. The sound of wooden benches creaking under shifting weight filled the room. Judge Bennett took his seat, arranged his papers, and prepared to begin the day's proceedings. The first few cases moved quickly, routine matters that required little more than reviewing documents and issuing standard fines. A young man who ran a red light, an elderly woman who forgot to renew her parking permit, a teenager who was caught driving without insurance. Judge Bennett handled each case with efficiency, if not much warmth. His colleagues often joked that he ran his courtroom like a Swiss watch, precise, reliable, and completely predictable. He took pride in this reputation. After all, wasn't justice supposed to be consistent and unwavering? As the morning progressed, he noticed the courthouse's usual characters filtering in and out. There was Mary from the cafeteria, delivering coffee to the court officers, Tom, the veteran court reporter, typing away at his stenograph machine with practiced precision. Even Mr. Peterson, the elderly gentleman who seemed to show up every week just to watch the proceedings, sat in his usual spot in the back row. What Judge Bennett didn't notice, however, was the elegant woman who had just rushed through the courthouse doors, slightly out of breath from climbing the courthouse steps. Dr. Amara Richardson had just finished chairing an emergency meeting of the State Judicial Review Committee and was running late for her court appearance. She quietly took a seat in the back of the courtroom, straightening her designer suit and checking her phone one last time before turning it off. The clock on the wall showed 10:45 a.m. Judge Bennett glanced at his docket, noting that he was making good time. He had no way of knowing that in less than an hour, his entire worldview would be challenged, and his carefully ordered universe would be turned upside down. "Next case," he called out, his voice echoing through the courtroom. Sarah shuffled her papers, preparing to call the next defendant. The morning sun had risen higher now, its rays illuminating the dust particles floating in the air, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere in the otherwise ordinary courtroom. Case number 247, Dr. Amara Richardson, parking violation on Commonwealth Avenue, Sarah announced, her voice carrying through the now quiet courtroom. Dr. Richardson stood up gracefully, her posture perfect as she made her way to the front. At 45 years old, she carried herself with the confidence that came from years of professional success. Her dark skin contrasted beautifully with her cream-colored suit, and her natural hair was styled in a neat professional updo. As she approached the podium, several of her phones buzzed silently in her designer briefcase. Being the chair of the State Judicial Review Committee meant she was always in demand, but right now, those messages would have to wait. She had rushed here directly from an emergency committee meeting about judicial appointments. including one particularly interesting case she would be reviewing later that afternoon. Judge Bennett barely glanced up from his papers. Says here you parked in a restricted zone for over 3 hours, blocking access to a fire hydrant. His tone was bored, almost dismissive, as if he'd already made up his mind about the case. Your Honor, if I may explain, Dr. Richardson began, her voice clear and measured. There were exceptional circumstances that day. The circumstances don't change the fact that you broke the law. Judge Bennett interrupted, still not really looking at her. He shuffled some papers on his desk, treating this like just another routine case. Dr. Richardson tried again. Sir, I understand the seriousness of the violation, but I was attending to an urgent matter at the nearby hospital. A close friend was. Ms. Richardson, Judge Bennett cut her off again, finally looking up but only briefly. Everyone who comes into this courtroom has a story. Everyone has an excuse. The law doesn't care about excuses. A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even Sarah, the clerk, looked somewhat surprised at the judge's unusually harsh tone. Officer Rodriguez, standing by the door, raised his eyebrows slightly. Dr. Richardson corrected politely. It's Dr. Richardson, Your Honor. And I'm not offering excuses, I'm providing context for. Doctor, lawyer, or street sweeper, the law applies equally to everyone, Judge Bennett said firmly, his voice carrying a hint of irritation. The fine is $500, plus court costs. Next case. Dr. Richardson stood there for a moment, her expression unreadable. She'd spent years dealing with people who made assumptions about her based on appearance. Something about this interaction felt different. Perhaps it was because in just a few hours, she would be sitting across from this very judge in a very different setting. As she turned to leave, she noticed Sarah, the court clerk, giving her an apologetic look. Dr. Richardson gave her a small, knowing smile in return. She had learned long ago that getting angry rarely solved anything. Besides, the afternoon's Judicial Review Committee meeting would be interesting. Back at her seat, Dr. Richardson pulled out her phone and sent a quick message to her assistant. Prepare Judge Bennett's promotion application file for this afternoon's review. I want to look at it again. Meanwhile, Judge Bennett continued with his cases, unaware that he had just treated one of the most influential legal minds in the state like a common traffic offender. He was already focusing on the next case, having completely forgotten about the well-dressed woman he had just fined. The morning continued its steady pace. More cases, more fines, more routine decisions. But something had shifted in the courtroom's atmosphere. The regular courthouse staff who had witnessed the interaction kept exchanging knowing looks. They had seen Judge Bennett be stern before, but this time felt different. As Dr. Richardson gathered her belongings to leave, she checked her watch. It was 11:30 a.m. In exactly 3 hours, she would be chairing the Judicial Review Committee meeting where Judge Bennett's application for promotion to the Superior Court would be discussed. She smiled slightly to herself as she walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. The morning sun was now high in the sky, and through the courthouse windows, it cast interesting shadows that seemed to dance across the walls, almost as if they were anticipating the drama that was about to unfold. Judge Bennett sat in his private chambers during the lunch break, reviewing his notes for the upcoming Judicial Review Committee meeting. His sandwich lay half-eaten on his desk as he adjusted his tie for the third time. This promotion to Superior Court would be the crowning achievement of his career, and he wanted everything to be perfect. Your Honor. Sarah knocked on his door, poking her head in. Your afternoon session starts in 5 minutes. Thank you, Sarah, he replied, gathering his papers. And remember, I'll need to leave promptly at 2:30 for that committee meeting. Back in the courtroom, Judge Bennett's mood had soured slightly. The morning's interaction with that parking violator, what was her name? Richardson, had left him feeling oddly unsettled. Something about her composed demeanor had gotten under his skin. Your Honor, a young public defender approached his bench. About the Richardson case from this morning. Case is closed, Judge Bennett said firmly. Next matter. The public defender persisted. Sir, if you just look at her credentials, Dr. Richardson is actually. Counselor, Judge Bennett's voice carried a warning tone. Are you questioning my ruling? The young lawyer backed away, shaking his head. No, Your Honor. My apologies. As the afternoon session progressed, whispers circulated through the courthouse. Court officers exchanged knowing looks. The clerk kept glancing nervously at the clock. Even Mr. Peterson, the elderly Judge Bennett, lowered himself into the chair, his legs feeling unusually weak. The leather seat creaked under his weight, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet conference room. He tried to speak, but his mouth felt dry as sandpaper. "Water, Judge Bennett?" Dr. Richardson asked, nodding to her assistant, who promptly placed a glass in front of him. Her voice remained professional, but there was a hint of something else in it. Not quite amusement, not quite anger, but something in between. "Dr. Richardson," you finally managed to say. I didn't realize." Clearly, she interrupted, much as he had done to her earlier that day. "Now, shall we begin reviewing your application for promotion to Superior Court?" She opened the thick folder in front of her, adjusting her reading glasses in a gesture that eerily mirrored his own courtroom habit. The other committee members, 5 distinguished legal professionals, sat quietly, watching the scene unfold. Among them was the young public defender who had tried to warn Judge Bennett earlier about Dr. Richardson's identity. "Your record shows 15 years on the bench," Dr. Richardson began, her finger trailing down the page. "Impressive case clearance rates. Minimal reversals on appeal." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "However, we've received some concerning feedback about your, shall we say, approach to different defendants." Judge Bennett felt his collar growing tighter. The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background, but he was sweating profusely. Through the large windows behind Dr. Richardson, he could see the same courthouse where, just hours ago, he had dismissed this woman without a second thought. "I have here," she continued, pulling out another file, "transcripts from your morning session. Interesting reading, wouldn't you say?" She didn't wait for his response, particularly the part where you refused to let a qualified professional explain the context of her situation. One of the committee members, an elderly Asian woman, spoke up. "Dr. Richardson, perhaps we should focus on the judge's overall record rather than this morning's incident." "Oh, but this is relevant, Margaret," Dr. Richardson replied, her voice calm but firm. "You see, Judge Bennett's interaction with me this morning wasn't an isolated incident. Our committee has received multiple reports of similar behavior patterns." She pressed a button on the conference room phone. "Please send in Ms. Thompson." A moment later, Sarah, his court clerk, walked in. Judge Bennett's eyes widened in surprise. Sarah, who had tried to warn him multiple times today, now stood before the committee, clutching a thick folder of her own. "Ms. Thompson," Dr. Richardson smiled warmly, "please share with the committee what you've observed in Judge Bennett's courtroom over the past year." Sarah cleared her throat nervously. "I've kept records," she began, avoiding Judge Bennett's shocked stare. "Statistics on how different defendants are treated. The average fines imposed, speaking time allowed, interruptions during testimony." She placed her folder on the table. "The patterns are quite clear when you look at the data." Judge Bennett felt the room spinning slightly. All those times Sarah had tried to speak to him today, all those knowing looks in the courthouse corridors, everything suddenly made terrible sense. "I don't discriminate," he protested weakly. "I treat everyone the same." "Do you?" Dr. Richardson raised an eyebrow. "The numbers tell a different story, Your Honor. For instance, this morning you interrupted me 3 times in less than 2 minutes. According to Ms. Thompson's records, that's a common occurrence with certain demographics, while others are given much more time to speak." She stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the city. "The position you're applying for requires not just legal knowledge, but wisdom, fairness, and most importantly, the ability to recognize and correct one's own biases." Turning back to face him, she continued, "The question before this committee isn't just whether you're qualified on paper, Judge Bennett. It's whether you're capable of growth, of seeing beyond your preconceptions of true justice." The afternoon sun cast Dr. Richardson's shadow long across the conference room floor, reaching all the way to where Judge Bennett sat, still struggling to find words to defend himself. In the distance, the courthouse clock tower began to chime 3 o'clock, each ring seeming to echo his mounting realizations. Judge Bennett sat alone in his study at home that night, his dinner untouched on the desk beside him. The clock on the wall showed 11:30 p.m., but sleep felt impossible after the day's events. His laptop glowed in the darkness, playing back recordings from his courtroom sessions, recordings he'd never bothered to watch before. Next case, his voice echoed from the speakers. He watched himself on the screen, barely looking up as a young Hispanic mother tried to explain her situation. Another click, another case. An elderly Asian man attempting to describe a complex parking situation, only to be cut off mid-sentence. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his glass of water. The committee meeting had ended with Dr. Richardson suggesting he take some time to review his past cases. Sometimes, she had said, her voice gentle but firm, we need to see ourselves through others' eyes to understand the impact of our actions. Sarah, his clerk, had left a large box of files on his desk before leaving for the day. On top was a note. I've been keeping these records for 3 years, Your Honor. I tried to tell you many times. Inside were carefully organized statistics, showing clear patterns in his courtroom behavior, patterns he had never noticed, or perhaps had chosen not to notice. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his daughter, Emily, a law student in her final year. Dad, I heard about what happened today. Can we talk? He stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. Come over if you're free. I could use a friendly face. 20 minutes later, Emily sat across from him in his study, her expression concerned. At 25, she reminded him so much of her mother, who had passed away 5 years ago. She had the same direct way of speaking, the same inability to ignore uncomfortable truths. Dad, she said softly, do you remember when I was in high school, and I told you about Mr. Peterson, my science teacher? He looked up, confused by the sudden change in topic. The one who kept ignoring the girls in class. Yes, Emily nodded. And he told me something I never forgot. You said, sometimes good people can do unfair things without realizing it, because they've never had to think about how others experience the world. Judge Bennett felt his throat tighten. I said that? You did. Emily smiled sadly. And then you went to the school board and helped us present data showing the pattern of behavior. You believed in fairness then, Dad. You still do? You've just forgotten to look for your own blind spots. He turned back to his laptop, watching another courtroom session. This time, he saw himself allowing a well-dressed white businessman to explain at length about a traffic violation, nodding sympathetically. The contrast with how he treated Dr. Richardson was startling. I've been so focused on being efficient, on moving through cases quickly, he muttered, more to himself than to Emily. When did I stop seeing the people behind the cases? Emily reached across the desk and squeezed his hand. Recognition is the first step, Dad. That's what you always taught me. Through his study window, he could see the night sky, clear and star-filled. Somewhere across town, Dr. Richardson was probably reviewing his case files, deciding his professional fate. But strangely, this possible promotion didn't seem as important anymore. He picked up another file from Sarah's box. This one contained letters from defendants, complaints about his conduct that had never made it past his clerk's desk. She had tried to protect him while also documenting the problem, hoping he would eventually notice. I need to do better, he said finally, looking at his daughter. Not just for the promotion, but because it's right. Emily smiled. That's the dad I know. She stood up, gathering her things. Get some rest. Tomorrow's another day. After she left, Judge Bennett stayed up for several more hours, watching recordings, reading files, and taking notes. On a fresh legal pad, he began writing. Steps for change. The first light of dawn was creeping through his window before he finally went to bed, his mind full of plans for transformation. The next morning, Judge Bennett stood in the lobby of the State Building, clutching a folder and a small paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He'd arrived 30 minutes early for his 9 a.m. appointment with Dr. Richardson, requested through her assistant the night before. His reflection in the polished marble walls showed a different man than yesterday. His usual confident posture was replaced by something more humble. Dark circles under his eyes testified to his sleepless night of self-reflection. Judge Bennett. Dr. Richardson's assistant called from the reception desk. She'll see you now. The walk to her office felt longer than it should have. Each step on the plush carpet seemed to echo his racing heartbeat. When he reached her door, he took a deep breath before knocking. Come in, Dr. Richardson's voice called from inside. Her office was impressive but welcoming. Large windows offered a panoramic view of the city, including the courthouse where they first encountered each other. Dr. Richardson sat behind a substantial desk, various legal volumes neatly arranged on shelves behind her. "Good morning, Judge Bennett," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I must admit, I was surprised by your request for this meeting." He sat down, placing his untouched coffee on the coaster she offered. "Dr. Richardson, He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I spent last night reviewing my courtroom recordings." She leaned back in her chair, waiting patiently as he struggled to find the right words. "I saw myself," he continued, his voice slightly shaky. "Really saw myself, perhaps for the first time. The way I treated you yesterday wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern I've been blind to for years." Dr. Richardson's expression remained neutral, but her eyes softened slightly. "Go on." "My clerk, Sarah, she'd been trying to tell me. She kept detailed records." He opened the folder he brought, showing her some of Sarah's statistics. "I interrupted minority defendants 3 times more often than others. I gave them less time to explain their situations. I imposed higher fines for similar offenses." "And why are you sharing this with me now?" Dr. Richardson asked, her voice gentle but probing. "Because an apology without understanding is meaningless," he replied, meeting her eyes for the first time. "I'm not just sorry for how I treated you yesterday. I'm sorry for every person who came into my courtroom expecting justice and received prejudice instead." Dr. Richardson stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the courthouse. "You know, Judge Bennett, when I was a young lawyer, I had a judge much like yourself, efficient, strict, seemingly fair, until you looked at the patterns." She turned back to face him. "But unlike you, when confronted with his biases, he refused to acknowledge them. He never changed, and many people suffered because of it." "I want to do better," Judge Bennett said firmly. "Not just for the promotion, though I understand that's probably out of the question now, but because it's right, because every person who enters my courtroom deserves true justice, not just the appearance of it." Dr. Richardson returned to her desk and pressed a button on her phone. "Janet, could you bring in the diversity training proposal?" Her assistant entered with another folder, placing it in front of Judge Bennett. "This is a new program we're developing for judicial training," Dr. Richardson explained. "We've been looking for a pilot court to test it. Would you be interested in making your courtroom the first?" Judge Bennett picked up the folder, his hands steady now. "You trust me with this? After yesterday?" "Judge Bennett," she smiled slightly. "Recognition of our faults is the first step toward fixing them. You've shown more self-awareness in the past 24 hours than some show in a lifetime." The morning sun streamed through her office windows, illuminating both of them in its warm light. In that moment, something shifted, not just between them, but in Judge Bennett's understanding of what true justice meant. 3 months had passed since Judge Bennett's apology to Dr. Richardson. The Boston Municipal Court looked the same from the outside, but inside, changes were happening that nobody could have predicted. On this particular morning, Judge Bennett sat in his chambers, reviewing case files with Sarah. The wall behind his desk, once bare except for his law degree, now displayed colorful charts tracking courtroom statistics. Each graph showed speaking times, interruption rates, and fine amounts across different demographic groups. "The numbers are improving, Your Honor," Sarah said, pointing to the latest data. "Last month showed almost equal speaking times for all defendants, regardless of background." Judge Bennett nodded, adjusting his reading glasses. "And the feedback forms?" "Much better," Sarah smiled, pulling out a stack of papers. "Especially since we started the translation services and extended court hours to accommodate working parents." A knock on the door interrupted them. It was Officer Rodriguez, the court bailiff. "Judge, your 9 a.m. training session is ready to begin." The judge stood up, straightening his robes. In the main conference room, 20 other judges from various district courts waited. They had come to learn about the pilot program that was making waves in the legal community. "Good morning," Judge Bennett began, his voice carrying the same authority as always, but with a new hint of humility. "Today, we're going to discuss something that took me 62 years to learn, how our unconscious biases affect justice." As he spoke, Dr. Richardson slipped quietly into the back of the room. She smiled, watching him share his story with his peers. The same man who had dismissed her 3 months ago was now teaching others about the importance of equal treatment. Let me show you something, he continued, pulling up video clips from his old court sessions. This is who I was. The screen showed his previous behavior, the interruptions, the dismissive tone, the rushed judgments. And this, he switched to recent footage, is who I'm trying to become. The new clips showed him listening patiently, asking thoughtful questions, and ensuring every person felt heard. One of the older judges raised his hand. But doesn't this slow down the court process? We have dozens of cases each day. Actually, Sarah chimed in, stepping forward with more charts. Our case clearance rate has improved. When people feel heard, they're less likely to appeal or file complaints. It saves time in the long run. During the lunch break, Dr. Richardson approached Judge Bennett. Impressive presentation, she said. How does it feel to be on the teaching side of the bench? Humbling, he replied honestly. Every time I share my story, I remember that morning in your courtroom. Best mistake I ever made, getting you angry at me. She laughed. I wasn't angry, Judge Bennett. I was hopeful. I saw an opportunity for real change. Back in his courtroom that afternoon, a young woman with a parking violation stood before him. She spoke broken English, clutching her papers nervously. Your Honor, the court interpreter translated. She says she parked illegally because her child was sick and the hospital parking was full. The old Judge Bennett would have cut her off. The new Judge Bennett listened carefully, asked questions through the interpreter, and considered the circumstances before making his decision. As the woman left, visibly relieved by the fair hearing she'd received, Sarah handed him the latest statistical report. The graphs showed no significant differences in treatment across racial, gender, or socioeconomic lines for the first time since she'd started keeping records. We're getting there, he said quietly, looking at the numbers. Outside his window, the afternoon sun painted the courthouse steps in warm light. A group of law students toured the building, their faces full of hope and idealism. Judge Bennett watched them, remembering his own early days and wishing someone had taught him these lessons sooner. But as Dr. Richardson often reminded him, it's never too late to learn and change. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning in the courtroom. The Boston State Building's Grand Conference Hall was packed with judges, lawyers, and legal professionals from across the country. The occasion? The annual Judicial Excellence Award ceremony. Judge Michael Bennett sat in the front row, his daughter Emily beside him. His hands rested on a speech folder in his lap, though he'd memorized every word weeks ago. The nervous energy in his stomach reminded him of his first day on the bench, 15 years earlier. And now, the ceremony host announced, to present our final award for innovative justice reform, please welcome Dr. Amara Richardson, chair of the State Judicial Review Committee. Dr. Richardson approached the podium, elegant as ever in a royal blue suit. The spotlight caught the silver in her hair as she adjusted the microphone. 1 year ago, she began, a traffic violation case in my local courthouse led to something extraordinary. Not because of the case itself, but because of what happened afterward. In the audience, Judge Bennett felt Emily squeeze his hand. Sarah, his clerk, sitting on his other side, wiped a tear from her eye. The judge in that case could have ignored his biases. He could have defended his actions or dismissed the criticism. Instead, he chose to look in the mirror, really look, and then he chose to change. Dr. Richardson gestured to the large screen behind her, which showed statistics from the pilot program. In 1 year, this program has been adopted by 37 courts across 6 states. Complaint rates have dropped by 60%, appeal rates are down 40%, but numbers don't tell the whole story. She picked up a small stack of letters. These are from people who appeared in Judge Bennett's courtroom both before and after the program. One writes, I felt like a human being this time, not just a case number. Another says, for the first time in my life, I believe justice was truly blind. Judge Bennett blinked rapidly, fighting back tears as Dr. Richardson continued. But perhaps most importantly, this program has created a ripple effect. Other judges have followed his example. Law schools are incorporating these lessons into their curriculum. The next generation of legal professionals will start their careers with awareness we had to learn the hard way. She smiled directly at Judge Bennett. Would you please join me on stage, Your Honor? As he stood, the audience erupted in applause. His walk to the podium felt both longer and shorter than it should have. Dr. Richardson held out her hand, but instead of shaking it, She pulled him into a warm hug. The Innovative Justice Reform Award goes to Judge Michael Bennett, she announced, not just for implementing change in his own courtroom, but for having the courage to share his story and inspire change in others. Taking the podium, Judge Bennett looked out at the sea of faces. He saw young law students in the back, taking notes. He saw his fellow judges, many of whom had gone through the training program. He saw his daughter Emily, beaming with pride. 1 year ago, he began, his voice steady, I thought I knew what justice looked like. I was wrong. True justice isn't just about following the law, it's about seeing the humanity in every person who enters our courtrooms. He held up the Crystal Award. This doesn't belong to just me. It belongs to Dr. Richardson, who turned a moment of bias into an opportunity for growth. It belongs to Sarah, who had the courage to document uncomfortable truths. It belongs to every person who helped me learn and change. As the ceremony ended and people mingled at the reception, the young public defender approached Judge Bennett. Sir, she said hesitantly, I'm starting my career next month. Any advice? He looked at her, then at Dr. Richardson across the room, then back at the young lawyer. Remember that every person who stands before you has a story. Your job isn't just to hear the case, it's to hear the human being. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, a fitting end to a day that celebrated transformation. Judge Bennett's story had become more than just a cautionary tale. It had become a beacon of hope, showing that change is possible at any age, and that true justice begins with understanding.